Marcus Vail thought humiliating the quiet costume assistant in front of the entire cast would earn him a few laughs before rehearsal began. But within the next 10 minutes, the most arrogant actors in New York were about to discover that the woman they mocked backstage had once been the brightest star on Broadway. And by the time the curtains stopped trembling under the theater lights, nobody in that room would ever forget the name Clara Whitmore again. The old Grand Regent Theater pulsed with nervous energy as stagehands rushed across the wooden floors carrying lighting cables, costume racks, and half-finished props. Dust floated through the warm golden beams hanging above the empty velvet seats while actors practiced lines near the center stage, their voices echoing through the massive auditorium like overlapping waves. Near the backstage wardrobe station, Clara Whitmore quietly stitched the loose hem of a dark blue performance jacket under the dim glow of a small desk lamp. At 42, Clara had perfected the art of becoming invisible. Her soft gray cardigan blended into the theater walls almost as naturally as her silence. Her brown hair was tied back in a low ponytail, and her movements carried the calm precision of someone used to working unnoticed. Most of the cast barely looked at her unless they needed something fixed, cleaned, steamed, or carried. "Costume lady," one actor called casually as he tossed a wrinkled shirt onto her table without stopping. Clara simply nodded. "I'll take care of it." Across the stage, Olivia Kane stood beneath the spotlight rehearsing dramatic lines with exaggerated intensity, while director Marcus Vail watched impatiently from the front row. Marcus had built his reputation on ruthless perfection and public humiliation. He believed fear created greatness, and everyone in the theater knew better than to challenge him. Again, Marcus snapped sharply, rising from his seat. "You're performing like this is community theater, Olivia." Olivia rolled her eyes, but forced another smile before repeating the scene. Nearby actors exchanged nervous glances. Nobody wanted Marcus's attention for too long. As Clara quietly carried a repaired dress toward the stage, two younger actresses standing near the makeup mirrors began whispering loudly enough for her to hear. "I heard she's been working backstage here for years," one smirked. "Imagine spending your whole life around Broadway and never actually making it on stage." The other laughed softly. "Maybe she froze during auditions or something." Clara kept walking as if she hadn't heard a word, but her fingers tightened slightly around the hanger. Marcus suddenly clapped his hands loudly, silencing the room. "Everyone gather center stage," he ordered. The cast slowly circled around him beneath the rehearsal lights. Clara tried slipping quietly back toward the wardrobe station when Marcus noticed her. "You," he called sharply. "Gray cardigan." Clara stopped. The room turned toward her almost instantly. "Yes, Mr. Vail?" she asked softly. Marcus smirked as several actors already began grinning in anticipation. "Since you spend so much time standing around listening to rehearsals," he said, his voice dripping with amusement, "why don't you help us entertain the room for once?" A few actors chuckled immediately. Clara remained still. "I'm sorry." Marcus leaned back against the stage piano with folded arms. "Come up here and read Olivia's lines while she takes 5. Unless memorizing scripts is beyond the wardrobe department." Laughter spread across the stage. Olivia crossed her arms with a smug smile, while someone near the back muttered, "This should be good." Clara's eyes lowered toward the polished wooden floor as silence settled around her. Then slowly, almost carefully, she stepped toward the center spotlight while the entire cast watched like they were waiting for a joke to begin. None of them noticed the elderly pianist near the orchestra pit suddenly staring at Clara with growing disbelief. The theater remained strangely quiet as Clara stepped into the center spotlight with the script trembling lightly between her fingers. The laughter that had filled the stage moments earlier slowly faded into scattered whispers, while Marcus Vail watched with folded arms, clearly expecting humiliation to entertain his exhausted cast before rehearsal resumed. Olivia Kane leaned casually against the piano, sipping bottled water with a smirk that barely concealed her amusement. "This scene starts on page 42, Marcus said loudly. "Try not to put the audience to sleep." A few actors chuckled again. Clara nodded once without looking up. The spotlight washed over her pale face while the empty red seats stretched endlessly beyond the stage like silent witnesses waiting for something none of them expected. Near the orchestra pit, the elderly pianist, Harold Bennett, continued staring at Clara with growing confusion. His weathered fingers slowly lowered from the piano keys, as if he had suddenly forgotten where he was. Clara lifted the script carefully and took a slow breath. "You abandoned me long before you walked out that door," she read softly. The room barely reacted at first. Her voice sounded calm, almost fragile. Marcus glanced toward Olivia with a smug expression that practically invited ridicule. But then Clara continued. The silence came first, then the loneliness, then the pretending. Something shifted. Her tone deepened with emotion so natural and restrained that several actors unconsciously straightened where they stood. Olivia lowered her water bottle slightly. Clara was no longer reading lines. She was living them. Every word carried the weight of memory. Every pause felt deliberate. The theater itself seemed to quiet around her voice. Harold Bennett suddenly rose from the piano bench, his eyes widening as realization slowly crept across his face. 15 years earlier, he had played in the orchestra during one of the most celebrated Broadway productions of the decade. And now, standing beneath the rehearsal lights in a gray cardigan and worn backstage shoes, the woman everyone mocked sounded exactly like the actress who once brought entire audiences to tears night after night. "No," Harold whispered under his breath. "It cannot be." On stage, Clara lowered the script completely. She no longer needed it. Marcus's smirk faded inch by inch as Clara stepped forward into the full beam of the spotlight. "You think applause means love?" she said quietly, her eyes fixed somewhere beyond the empty seats. "It does not. Applause fades in seconds. But loneliness stays with you after the curtains close." The cast had gone completely silent now. Even the stage crew near the lighting rig stopped moving. Olivia's confident posture slowly stiffened as Clara delivered the final lines with heartbreaking restraint instead of theatrical exaggeration. There was no overacting, no dramatic gestures, just honesty so raw that the massive theater suddenly felt painfully small. When Clara finally stopped speaking, the silence that followed felt electric. Marcus stared at her without blinking. One actor quietly lowered his script. Another swallowed hard, visibly emotional. Olivia looked unsettled for the first time all day. Harold Bennett slowly climbed the stairs from the orchestra pit, unable to take his eyes off Clara. "Clara Whitmore," he said softly into the silence. Several cast members exchanged confused looks. Marcus frowned immediately. "Wait," one actress whispered. "You mean the Clara Whitmore?" Harold nodded faintly, still staring at her in disbelief. "The woman standing on this stage right now," he said carefully, "was once the greatest actress Broadway had ever seen." The room went dead silent. The silence inside the Grand Regent Theater seemed to stretch endlessly after Harold Bennett spoke Clara Whitmore's name aloud. Actors who had been laughing only minutes earlier now stared at the quiet woman beneath the spotlight, as though the stage itself had suddenly shifted beneath their feet. Marcus Vail blinked hard, trying to process what he had just heard. "That is impossible," Olivia Kane said first, forcing out a nervous laugh. "Clara Whitmore disappeared years ago." Harold slowly stepped closer to the stage, his polished shoes echoing softly against the wooden floor. "I played piano for her opening night in Chicago," he said quietly. "Then Boston. Then Broadway." His voice carried the weight of memory. Every standing ovation. Every sold-out theater. I would know that voice anywhere. Clara lowered her eyes immediately, uncomfortable with every second of attention now falling onto her. "Harold," she said softly, "please." But Harold shook his head slowly. "No," he replied, "not after all these years." The cast exchanged stunned glances while whispers spread across the stage like sparks catching fire. Younger actors pulled out phones, quickly searching the name. One by one, expressions changed from confusion to disbelief. Olivia grabbed a phone from a nearby actress and stared down at the screen herself. Old magazine covers appeared beneath the harsh glow of rehearsal lights. Clara Whitmore, standing center stage in elegant gowns. Clara accepting theater awards. Clara smiling beside famous Broadway directors almost 2 decades earlier. The difference between those glamorous photos and the quiet woman standing before them now felt almost impossible to understand. "Oh my God," one actor whispered. "That is her." Marcus's confident posture slowly collapsed into uneasy silence. For the first time that day, he no longer looked like the most powerful person in the theater. Clara gently set the script down on the piano and stepped back from the spotlight, as if trying to disappear into the shadows again. "It was a long time ago," she said calmly. "People move on." But nobody moved. Nobody even spoke. Olivia folded her arms tightly, struggling to hide the panic beginning to surface beneath her polished confidence. "If you were really Clara Whitmore," she said carefully, "then why are you sewing costumes backstage?" Clara hesitated. The question lingered painfully in the theater air. Harold's expression softened immediately, as though he already knew the answer. "Because life happens," Clara finally said quietly. "And sometimes the stage stops feeling like home." Marcus finally climbed onto the stage himself, his face pale beneath the overhead lights. "You expect us to believe that one of the biggest theater stars in America spent the last 6 years working wardrobe in my production?" Clara looked at him steadily for the first time all evening. "You never asked my last name." The room fell silent again. Marcus opened his mouth, but found nothing to say. Because she was right. Nobody backstage had ever cared enough to ask who Clara Whitmore really was. To them, she had simply been the quiet woman fixing torn jackets and carrying coffee trays through crowded rehearsals. Olivia glanced again at the old photos on the phone screen. "You left at the height of your career," she said. "People said you vanished after your husband died." Clara's expression shifted almost imperceptibly. A flicker of pain crossed her face before disappearing behind calm restraint. Harold lowered his eyes respectfully. Nobody laughed anymore. Nobody smirked. The entire theater now watched Clara with something completely different in their eyes. Not amusement, not pity, respect. And somewhere deep inside the massive empty auditorium, Marcus Vail began realizing that humiliating Clara Whitmore in front of investors might become the single greatest mistake of his entire career. The tension inside the theater shifted completely after Clara's identity was revealed. The same actors who had mocked her less than an hour earlier now avoided direct eye contact, suddenly aware of every careless joke and dismissive comment they had made backstage over the past several months. Clara quietly returned toward the wardrobe station as if nothing extraordinary had happened, but the room no longer saw her as invisible. Every movement she made now carried a strange gravity. Marcus Vail remained near center stage, struggling to regain control of the rehearsal. His jaw tightened as investors seated near the back whispered among themselves while repeatedly glancing toward Clara. He had spent years building his image as the genius director who discovered greatness before anyone else. And now the greatest performer in the building had been sewing costumes 20 feet away from him for months without his knowledge. The humiliation burned beneath his composed expression. "All right," Marcus finally announced sharply, clapping his hands once. "Break is over. Back to rehearsal." But the energy had changed too much. Olivia Kane missed 2 lines almost immediately. Another actor stumbled through choreography he had mastered weeks earlier. Nobody could stop thinking about Clara Whitmore standing quietly backstage while they complained about long rehearsals and spotlight positions. Harold Bennett slowly approached Clara near the costume racks while she folded a silk jacket with calm precision. "Why did you never tell anyone?" he asked softly. Clara smiled faintly without looking up. "Because I did not want to be Clara Whitmore anymore." Harold studied her carefully. "People spent years wondering what happened to you." Clara paused for a moment. "After Daniel died," she said quietly, "the theater stopped sounding the same." Harold's expression softened immediately. Daniel Whitmore had been one of Broadway's most respected composers before a sudden heart condition took his life 15 years earlier. The tragedy had dominated headlines for months. Then Clara vanished completely from public life. "You could have come back any time," Harold said gently. Clara folded the final costume and placed it carefully onto the rack. Some losses change the way applause feels. Before Harold could respond, Marcus approached them with forced confidence and an artificial smile that fooled absolutely no one. "Ms. Whitmore," he said loudly enough for nearby investors to hear. "I wish you had introduced yourself earlier. We would have welcomed your experience." Clara looked at him calmly. "Would you?" Marcus hesitated briefly. Around them, several actors quietly watched the interaction while pretending not to. "Of course," Marcus replied smoothly. "Talent belongs on stage." Clara held his gaze for a long second. "Interesting," she said softly. "Because 10 minutes ago you seemed very comfortable humiliating me in front of your cast." The nearby silence became immediate and heavy. Marcus's expression stiffened. Olivia looked down at the floor. Nobody stepped in to defend him. Marcus forced out a restrained laugh. "It was rehearsal banter," he replied carefully. "Theater people joke." Clara nodded faintly. Sometimes jokes reveal more than honesty does. Harold lowered his eyes to hide a smile. Marcus's face reddened slightly beneath the warm rehearsal lights. For perhaps the first time in years, he found himself standing in front of someone he could not intimidate. One of the investors suddenly approached from the front rows, a silver-haired woman dressed in an elegant navy coat. "Clara Whitmore," she said warmly, extending her hand. "Eleanor Hayes. I financed your final Broadway production before you disappeared." Clara looked genuinely surprised. "Mrs. Hayes." Eleanor smiled softly. "You still have the ability to silence an entire theater with one scene." Olivia quietly watched the exchange from across the stage, insecurity slowly overtaking her confidence. Because deep down, she had begun realizing something terrifying. The audience they hoped to impress tonight no longer cared about the production's star actress. They were all watching Clara now. As rehearsal continued, the atmosphere inside the Grand Regent Theater became painfully strained. Every actor suddenly seemed aware of Clara Whitmore's presence backstage. Conversations lowered when she walked past. Jokes stopped midway. Even the younger stagehands who normally rushed through costume stations now spoke to her with careful politeness. But Clara herself behaved exactly the same as before. She quietly repaired loose buttons, organized garments by scene number, and steamed costumes beneath the warm backstage lights, as though the entire theater had not just rediscovered who she was. That calmness unsettled Marcus Vail more than anything else. Most performers would have embraced the sudden admiration. Clara avoided it entirely, and somehow that made everyone respect her even more. Olivia Kane stood near the makeup mirrors reapplying lipstick with visibly shaking hands. Every few seconds, her eyes drifted toward Clara. The investors seated throughout the auditorium were no longer watching Olivia rehearse. They were watching the quiet woman backstage who once ruled Broadway. Olivia could feel it happening in real time. Attention was slipping away from her. "Places for Act 2, Marcus called sharply, trying to regain authority. The cast quickly moved into position beneath the towering stage lights, while Clara carried a repaired emerald green coat toward the wings. As she passed Olivia, the actress suddenly grabbed the coat from her hands harder than necessary. "You could have said something," Olivia muttered under her breath. Clara looked at her calmly. "About what?" Olivia's jaw tightened. "About who you are." Clara studied her for a moment before answering softly. "Would it have changed how you treated me?" Olivia said nothing, because deep down, she already knew the answer. Across the stage, Eleanor Hayes remained seated in the front row beside two investors while quietly reviewing notes. Every so often, she glanced toward Clara with visible curiosity. Harold Bennett approached Eleanor carefully during the rehearsal reset. "You are thinking the same thing I am, aren't you?" he asked quietly. Eleanor smiled faintly. That this production suddenly found its real star? Harold nodded once. Meanwhile, Marcus forced the rehearsal forward with increasing frustration. Olivia stumbled through emotional scenes she had once mastered effortlessly. Her confidence had cracked. Every line now sounded performative beside the memory of Clara's raw authenticity earlier that evening. Marcus noticed it too. And worse, so did the investors. "Stop!" Marcus snapped suddenly from the front row. Olivia froze beneath the spotlight. "You are pushing too hard again," Marcus said impatiently. "The emotion feels fake." Olivia looked stunned. Marcus had never criticized her publicly in front of investors before. "I am doing exactly what we practiced," she replied carefully. Marcus rubbed his forehead with visible irritation. "Then perhaps what we practiced is not enough anymore." The room fell awkwardly silent. Olivia's face flushed with embarrassment while several actors exchanged nervous glances. Marcus immediately realized his mistake, but it was too late. Clara quietly lowered her eyes and returned to adjusting costumes near the wings, refusing to involve herself. But Marcus's frustration continued building. He could feel the production slipping away from him one uncomfortable moment at a time. Finally, during another reset, Eleanor Hayes stood slowly from her seat and addressed Marcus directly. "Mr. Vail," she said calmly, "would you indulge an old investor for one small experiment?" Marcus straightened immediately. "Of course." Eleanor glanced toward Clara. "I would like to see Ms. Whitmore perform the final monologue tonight." The entire theater froze. Olivia's face drained of color almost instantly. Marcus stared at Eleanor in disbelief. "The final monologue," he repeated carefully. Eleanor nodded. I finance theater long enough to recognize greatness when I see it. She smiled faintly. And I would very much like to know whether Broadway lost Clara Whitmore forever, or whether she simply stopped believing the world deserved her. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything the theater had experienced all night. Then slowly, every eye in the building turned toward Clara once again. For several long seconds, Clara Whitmore did not move after Eleanor Hayes requested the final monologue. The massive theater seemed suspended in complete stillness beneath the warm rehearsal lights. Even the stage crew stopped pretending to work. Olivia Kane stood frozen near center stage, her breathing shallow as panic slowly overtook the polished confidence she had carefully built over years of applause and magazine covers. Marcus Vail looked trapped between opportunity and humiliation. Part of him understood exactly what Eleanor was asking for. If Clara performed tonight and succeeded, every investor in the room would remember this rehearsal forever. But another part of him feared something far worse. Because deep down, Marcus already knew the truth. If Clara stepped fully back onto that stage, Olivia would disappear beside her. Clara finally lifted her eyes toward Eleanor. I have not performed in a very long time, she said softly. Eleanor smiled gently from the front row. Greatness does not disappear with time. Harold Bennett slowly returned to the piano bench, his hands resting lightly on the faded keys. Neither does music, he added quietly. Clara looked toward the empty audience seats stretching endlessly into darkness. 15 years earlier, those same rows would have been filled with cameras, critics, flowers, and thunderous applause waiting for her entrance. Back then she had lived beneath spotlights so bright they almost erased the person underneath them. Then Daniel died, and suddenly every stage felt cold. Every standing ovation sounded hollow. She had spent years convincing herself she no longer missed performing. But standing there now beneath the familiar warmth of theater lights, she realized something painful. Part of her never stopped loving it. Marcus cleared his throat awkwardly. Ms. Whitmore, he said carefully, forcing professionalism back into his voice. The monologue is 7 pages. We can provide a script. Clara shook her head gently. I remember it. Olivia's face tightened immediately. The final monologue was considered the hardest scene in the entire production. Olivia herself still struggled through portions of it during rehearsals. Clara slowly walked toward center stage again, while the theater remained utterly silent around her. The soft tapping of her shoes against the polished wood echoed through the auditorium with almost haunting clarity. Harold adjusted the piano bench slightly, watching her with emotional eyes. Ready? He asked softly. Clara nodded once. The spotlight dimmed around the edges of the stage until only Clara remained illuminated beneath the golden beam. Dust drifted slowly through the light above her shoulders while the rest of the theater faded into shadow. Then Clara began. People think grief arrives like a storm, she said quietly. Loud, violent, impossible to ignore. Her voice carried effortlessly across the empty seats. But real grief arrives softly. It sits beside you in silence while the rest of the world keeps moving. Nobody breathed. Olivia lowered herself slowly into a chair backstage without realizing it. Marcus stared motionless from the front row. Clara's performance did not feel rehearsed. It felt lived. Every word carried the weight of years hidden behind quiet eyes and backstage silence. Harold gently pressed the piano keys beneath her speech, adding soft notes that floated through the theater like distant memories. Clara stepped forward slightly into the light. The hardest part is not losing someone, she continued, her voice trembling just enough to feel real. It is learning how to remain yourself after they are gone. Eleanor Hayes slowly covered her mouth with one hand. One investor quietly removed his glasses to wipe his eyes. Even the young actors who had mocked Clara earlier now watched with stunned admiration. The room had gone completely silent again. But this time, it was not silence born from shock. It was reverence. Clara's voice lingered through the theater long after her final sentence faded into silence. Harold Bennett allowed the last piano note to drift softly into the empty auditorium before lifting his trembling hands from the keys. Nobody moved. Nobody even seemed willing to breathe too loudly. The emotional weight hanging over the Grand Regent Theater felt almost sacred. Clara remained standing beneath the spotlight with her hands gently folded in front of her, her expression calm despite the tears visible in several rows of faces watching her. For 15 years, Broadway critics had debated whether Clara Whitmore's greatness had been exaggerated by nostalgia. But in that moment, every person inside the theater understood the truth instantly. Legends do not disappear. They simply become stories people stop believing until they witness them again with their own eyes. Eleanor Hayes slowly rose to her feet first. Then Harold Bennett stood beside the piano. One by one, actors, investors, stagehands, and crew members followed until the entire theater erupted into a standing ovation so powerful it echoed through the old velvet walls like rolling thunder. Clara's eyes widened slightly in surprise. For a brief moment, she looked almost overwhelmed by the sound she had spent years avoiding. Olivia Kane remained seated longer than everyone else, staring at Clara beneath the spotlight with an expression caught somewhere between admiration and heartbreak. She had chased applause her entire life, but Clara had achieved something far greater in a matter of minutes. Respect. Real respect. Marcus Vail stood frozen near the front row as the standing ovation continued around him. He knew theater audiences better than anyone. Applause could be polite. It could be strategic. It could even be fake. But this was different. This was the kind of reaction directors spent entire careers hoping to create and almost never witnessed. Clara had done it effortlessly, without costumes, without makeup, without rehearsal, without even trying to impress anyone. Harold stepped closer to the stage, emotion thick in his voice. "Welcome home, Clara." The theater quieted slightly after his words. Clara lowered her eyes for a moment before answering softly. "I'm not sure the stage was ever truly home." Eleanor Hayes smiled gently through tears. "Maybe not," she replied. "But it was the one place where people saw your soul." The room fell silent again. Marcus finally stepped forward onto the stage, visibly humbled in a way nobody there had likely ever witnessed before. "Ms. Whitmore," he began carefully, "I owe you an apology." Clara looked at him quietly. Marcus swallowed hard beneath the stage lights. "I judged you before I knew anything about you," he admitted, "and I allowed others to do the same." Clara studied him for a long moment. Around them, nobody dared interrupt. "Most people do," she said softly. Marcus lowered his head slightly. "Still," he replied, "it was wrong." Olivia slowly approached from the wings, her confidence stripped away completely now. "I was cruel to you," she admitted quietly. "And I think," her voice caught briefly, "I think I was afraid." Clara's expression softened. "Afraid of what?" Olivia looked toward the empty audience seats glowing beneath dim gold lighting. "Of becoming forgettable." Clara glanced out at the theater herself before answering. "Fame disappears faster than people think." The room listened carefully as she continued. "The only thing audiences truly remember is honesty." Olivia lowered her eyes in silence. Somewhere above them, dust drifted slowly through the fading spotlight beams while the old theater settled into stillness once again. Then Eleanor Hayes suddenly smiled toward Marcus. "Well," she said calmly, "I believe tonight solved our casting problem." Marcus blinked in confusion. Eleanor folded her arms. "Because if Clara Whitmore agrees to return to this stage," she said, "every ticket in New York will sell out by morning." The entire cast turned toward Clara instantly. But Clara herself only looked quietly at the empty stage in front of her, as though she was hearing ghosts speak through the silence. The theater remained suspended in anticipation after Eleanor Hayes suggested Clara Whitmore return to the production. Nobody spoke. Nobody even shifted in their seats. The old Grand Regent seemed to hold its breath beneath the fading glow of rehearsal lights, while every eye remained fixed on the quiet woman standing center stage. Clara looked toward the empty audience seats for a very long moment before finally answering. "I cannot," she said softly. The disappointment that swept across the room was immediate. Marcus Vail's shoulders visibly dropped. Olivia Kane blinked in surprise. Even Harold Bennett lowered his eyes with quiet sadness. Eleanor Hayes stepped closer to the stage carefully. "Clara," she said gently, "what happened tonight was extraordinary." Clara smiled faintly, but there was pain behind it now. "Extraordinary moments are dangerous," she replied. "They make people believe old wounds no longer hurt." The theater fell silent again. Harold slowly stood from the piano bench and walked toward her. "Daniel would have wanted you to come back," he said softly. Clara's expression trembled for the first time all evening. She looked down immediately, her fingers tightening slightly against the fabric of her cardigan. "Please do not do that," she whispered. Harold's face softened with regret. "I am sorry." Clara took a slow breath before speaking again. "The last night I performed on Broadway," she said quietly. Daniel collapsed backstage before the final curtain. The room listened without movement. Everyone kept clapping while paramedics carried him out through the side entrance. Her voice remained calm, but the pain beneath it echoed through every word. "I remember standing center stage smiling for applause while the person I loved most in the world was dying behind the curtains." Olivia covered her mouth with one hand. Marcus slowly sat down in the front row without taking his eyes off Clara. "After that night," Clara continued softly, "I could not separate theater from grief anymore." The silence inside the Grand Regent became almost unbearable. No one had expected the truth to feel this heavy. For years, tabloids had invented stories about Clara Whitmore disappearing because of scandals, ego, addiction, or secret affairs. But the reality was far simpler and far sadder. She had walked away because the stage reminded her too much of love lost too suddenly. Harold's eyes filled with tears. "You carried that alone all these years." Clara nodded faintly. "Backstage work helped," she admitted. "No spotlight. No applause. Just quiet." Olivia slowly stepped closer now, her arrogance completely gone. "And we treated you like you were invisible," she said softly. Clara looked at her calmly. "Most invisible people are carrying stories nobody bothered to ask about." The words hit the room harder than any dramatic performance could have. Several actors quietly lowered their eyes in shame. Marcus rubbed his forehead slowly, realizing how many times Clara had walked silently through this theater while everyone judged her by a gray cardigan and a backstage badge. Eleanor Hayes finally climbed onto the stage herself, stopping only a few feet from Clara. "Then do not return for fame," she said gently. "Return because you still have something beautiful to give." Clara looked uncertain for the first time all night. Eleanor smiled warmly. "The world does not need another celebrity," she continued. "It needs honesty. And tonight you reminded everyone in this theater what honest performance looks like." Harold nodded quietly beside her. "You made people feel something real again." Clara's eyes slowly drifted across the empty auditorium one more time. The ancient velvet seats, the floating dust beneath warm lights, the scent of wood, paint, and aging curtains. Everything she had spent 15 years trying to forget still lived inside her somehow. Then, almost invisibly, Clara took one small step back toward center stage instead of away from it. And Marcus Vale immediately realized she was considering it. The Grand Regent Theater remained completely silent as Clara Whitmore stood beneath the fading spotlight, her eyes fixed on the empty rows of velvet seats stretching into darkness. Nobody interrupted her thoughts. Not Marcus Vale, not Olivia Kane, not even Eleanor Hayes. For the first time all evening, the theater no longer felt like a battlefield of egos and rehearsed performances. It felt honest. Clara slowly walked toward the very edge of the stage where years earlier she had once stood before sold-out audiences night after night. Her fingers brushed lightly against the heavy red curtain beside her as though reconnecting with something she had buried long ago. Harold Bennett watched quietly from beside the piano, understanding that this moment mattered far beyond contracts or ticket sales. It was about whether Clara Whitmore could forgive the stage itself. When Daniel died, Clara said softly into the stillness, "I thought leaving theater would stop the pain." The warm overhead lights cast long shadows across the wooden floor while every person listened in complete silence. "But grief follows you," she continued. "It waits in grocery stores, in apartments, in quiet mornings, in empty rooms." Olivia lowered her eyes slowly. Clara smiled faintly, though sadness lingered behind it. "The truth is, I was never running from Broadway." Her voice softened even more. "I was running from myself." The words settled heavily across the room. Marcus felt something shift inside him, hearing her speak with such honesty. For years he had believed greatness came from pressure, control, and fear. But Clara had commanded an entire theater without raising her voice once. Eleanor Hayes stepped closer carefully. "And what do you want now?" she asked gently. Clara looked around the theater one final time. The old piano, the faded curtains, the floating dust beneath amber lights, the nervous actors standing silently backstage. Then her eyes settled briefly on Olivia. "I think," Clara said quietly, I want young performers to understand something I learned too late. Olivia looked up slowly. Clara's voice remained calm and warm. Applause means very little if you lose kindness chasing it. The silence that followed felt deeply personal. Olivia's eyes filled with tears she no longer tried to hide. Marcus lowered his head quietly beside the front row. Even the youngest stagehand seemed moved by the weight of Clara's words. Then Eleanor smiled softly. That sounds very much like someone ready to come home. Clara let out a small breath that almost sounded like a laugh. For the first time all evening, the tension in her shoulders eased. She turned toward Marcus. If I return, she said carefully, there will be changes. Marcus straightened immediately. Anything. Clara glanced toward the cast. No more humiliation disguised as leadership. Marcus nodded without hesitation. Agreed. Clara looked toward Olivia next. And no actor in this theater will ever again be treated as more important than the crew standing behind them. Olivia swallowed hard before quietly answering. You have my word. Harold Bennett smiled through visible emotion. Now that sounds like real theater. A soft ripple of laughter moved through the room for the first time all night. Not cruel laughter. Not nervous laughter. Human laughter. Warm and relieved. Clara finally stepped fully back into the center spotlight. The golden light wrapped around her once more, but this time she did not flinch away from it. Eleanor Hayes smiled knowingly toward the investors seated behind her. Ladies and gentlemen, she said softly, Broadway just got its soul back. The room erupted into applause again, louder than before, but Clara no longer looked overwhelmed by it. She simply stood there quietly beneath the lights, her eyes shining with peace instead of pain. And somewhere deep inside the old Grand Regent Theater, everyone present understood the same truth at exactly the same moment. The quietest person in the room had carried the greatest strength all along. And that night, the world remembered what dignity truly looked like.